You can almost smell the lead before you see it. The air is thick with rosewater and decay, a sweetness that turns the stomach. You lean closer, the candlelight trembling across a pale, motionless face. Not marble, but skin, cracked, flaking, and white as chalk dust. The Queen of England lies still, her beauty dissolving beneath your gaze. Join a global community of history's witnesses, from London to Lahore, united by forgotten human stories that textbooks overlook and time remembers. The year is 1603. The great Queen Elizabeth I is dead. Her ladies-in-waiting, trained for decades in ritual and restraint, now face the most intimate and unsettling task of all, preparing her body for burial. They approach her bed not as servants, but as acolytes before a relic. The light catches the sheen on her cheeks, layers of powder so thick that they crack like old plaster. When they begin to wash her face, the first cloth comes away smeared with white, then another. Beneath the layers of Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, emerges the woman the world was never meant to see. Her skin pitted and gray, the surface corroded by years of poison. To her people, she had been Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of divine power wrapped in silk and ceremony. But to maintain that divinity, Elizabeth had waged a private war against her own flesh. She knew that her image was her weapon, more potent than any army or fleet. In an age when a monarch's face appeared on coins, portraits, and banners, her countenance was not merely skin, it was policy. When smallpox struck her in 1562, she nearly died. It left her fevered, disfigured, her once smooth cheeks scarred. The illness terrified her, not just for the pain it caused, but for what it threatened to reveal. A monarch who appeared frail invited whispers of divine displeasure, or weakness ripe for rebellion. So she turned to artifice. Venetian ceruse offered salvation, a brilliant white mask that could conceal every flaw, restore her youth, and command the illusion of immortality. It also contained enough lead to kill a lesser woman in months. Each morning, the Queen's cosmetic ritual unfolded like liturgy. Her women ground the powder, mixed it with vinegar, and applied it in layers with fine cloth pads. Rouge followed, cinnabar, rich and red, mined from mercury ore. The result was dazzling. A face smooth as porcelain, lips like lacquered blood, an icon more than a woman. To stand before her was to be blinded by purity, and to breathe in death. The lead seeped into her pores. The mercury entered her blood. Slowly, invisibly, it unmade her. Her hair thinned, her hands trembled, her memory faltered. But to Elizabeth, these were necessary sacrifices at the altar of sovereignty. Even her painters were bound by the illusion. She ordered that all portraits be modeled after a single face pattern, a youthful template from her prime. Artists were forbidden to record her aging features. Those who defied her risked royal wrath. The effect was astonishing. To the world, the Queen did not age. To her subjects, she was eternal. To herself, she was slipping away. There are accounts of courtiers seeing her up close in later years, startled, even horrified by the contrast between her portraits and her person. Beneath the powder, her skin was mottled and cracked, her teeth darkened. Her eyes, once brilliant, had grown ringed and weary. Yet she refused mirrors, forbade them from her chambers. To look upon her own decay was to acknowledge mortality, and that she could not do. Those closest to her whispered of the Queen's changing moods. At times, radiant and commanding. At others, irritable, withdrawn, haunted by shadows only she could see. Modern scholars suspect the tremors and melancholy that marked her final decade may have been symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, a slow chemical betrayal that no prayer or perfume could disguise. Still, she persisted, painting herself daily into legend. What drove her to such extremes? Power, yes, but also fear. Elizabeth had ruled a kingdom divided by faith, surrounded by enemies, haunted by the ghosts of murdered queens. Every blemish, every wrinkle, every tremor, could be interpreted as divine judgment, a sign of weakness in a woman whose right to rule was still contested. And so, she built her armor not of steel, but of powder and paint. Each layer a declaration. The queen does not age, the queen does not tire, the queen does not die. But the truth was waiting beneath. As her attendants washed her for the last time, they revealed the cost of that illusion. A face ravaged by the very tools that had made it timeless. The mask of immortality had outlived the woman who wore it. When they lifted her hands to fold them across her chest, the skin beneath the rings was discolored, her nails brittle and gray. Outside, London prepared for mourning. Bells tolling, torches burning, a nation weeping for its radiant sovereign. Inside, the scent of rosewater struggled against the darker smell of lead and flesh. In the quiet of that chamber, history's cruel irony came into focus. To remain forever young, Elizabeth had embraced the instruments of her decay. Her face, once England's brightest symbol, had become its final, silent warning. And as the white mask dissolved at last into the basin below, it revealed something even more unsettling than age or imperfection, the truth that no illusion, however perfect, can withstand the touch of time. The first thing that struck any visitor to the Tudor court was not its splendor, but its smell. Beneath the glitter of silk and gold, beneath the echo of music and the rustle of brocade, there lingered a stench that no perfume could quite smother. The air of England's palaces was thick with contradiction, the fragrance of roses warring against the reek of rot. It was the scent of a civilization at war with its own flesh. To step into Whitehall Palace in Elizabeth's time was to enter a world both magnificent and foul. The walls glowed with tapestries, the floors shimmered with rushes strewn fresh for visiting diplomats, and the Queen herself appeared immaculate, a walking garden of powdered lilies and sweet ambergris. Yet, behind the walls, the reality was less divine. Chamber pots overflowed. Cesspits festered beneath wooden floors. Even the Thames, rolling past her windows, had become a conduit of waste, its current thick with what the palace cast away. Elizabeth's court was a paradox in motion, a theater of elegance constructed upon filth. But to her, cleanliness was not a matter of sanitation. It was performance. In an age when water itself was feared as a vector of death, true washing was an act of courage, even recklessness. The belief ran deep that to open one's pores to water was to invite sickness into the body. And so, Elizabeth avoided full immersion, as did most of her realm. Instead, she purified herself symbolically. Her linen shifts, those plain white undergarments worn beneath the layers of royal attire, were changed several times a day. Her laundresses would carry the soiled linens away, believing, as physicians taught, that the cloth had drawn impurities from the flesh. It was cleansing by proxy, the illusion of purity achieved through repetition, not soap. Her attendants dabbed her skin with rosewater or vinegar infused with herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme. These were not baths, but ceremonies. The Queen's body was treated as a sacred object to be tended, not scrubbed. Each motion was careful, reverent, as though too much friction might erase something holy. "The Queen's grace is ever of sweet smell," one courtier remarked, and it was true, though the sweetness came at a cost. To maintain that fragrance, she surrounded herself with layers of scent. Her gloves, sewn in Spain and perfumed with ambergris and musk, left trails of sweetness wherever she moved. Her wigs were powdered with iris and clove. Even her letters carried her essence, the paper dusted with perfume, sealing her presence into every dispatch. The court followed suit. Nobles drenched themselves in rose oil and civet until the air itself shimmered with a cloying density. But the stronger the perfume, the closer the rot. Behind the painted screens and arras hangings, the court's secrets festered. Servants emptied chamber pots by hand, their contents flung into courtyards or directly into the river. In the corridors of Hampton Court, rats scurried beneath velvet drapes. The rushes on the floor, meant to freshen the rooms, were rarely changed, trapping food scraps and refuse until they rotted in place. When visitors spoke of the living smell of the court, they meant it literally. And yet Elizabeth's presence transformed this squalor into something strangely majestic. Her every motion was ritualized, even the most human of necessities. When nature called, she did not retire in solitude, but performed the act through ceremony. Her close stool, a padded, velvet-covered chair concealing a ceramic bowl, was attended by the most trusted officer in the royal household, the groom of the stool. Far from being a figure of ridicule, this man was among the most powerful in the kingdom, privy to the queen's confidences and her vulnerabilities. To serve at that stool was to serve at the very edge of divinity. Imagine the intimacy of that world. Perfumed candles flickering, the faint strain of lute music echoing through damp corridors, and somewhere within, the queen herself, cloaked in velvet, unwashed but radiant, issuing decrees over the scent of roses and waste. This was not hypocrisy. It was theater, elevated to the level of governance. To her subjects, Elizabeth's immaculate image was proof of divine favor. Her scent, delicate, elusive, marked her as something apart from common humanity. In the hierarchy of odor, sweetness meant sanctity, while foulness meant sin. The court thus became a cathedral of scent, every body disguised beneath layers of spice and flower. But it was also a trap. The more they perfumed, the more they suffocated beneath their own illusions. One ambassador from Venice once complained that an audience with the Queen was a pleasure to the eye but a trial to the nose. His words, though impolite, captured a truth about Tudor life itself, that beauty and corruption were inseparable. The scent of roses was both mask and confession. In private moments, when the torches dimmed and the courtiers withdrew, Elizabeth sometimes ordered the windows thrown open to the night. The cold air from the river carried its own reek, of smoke, of tar, of refuse, but also of freedom. For a moment, perhaps, she could breathe without the suffocating perfume of her own myth. But soon the windows closed again, the air sweetened with rosewater, and the illusion restored. Her palaces were not just homes. They were organisms, living and dying by the rhythm of scent and rot. The groom of the stool emptied his silver bowl. The laundresses scoured linens that would never truly be clean. And through it all, the Virgin Queen floated above the stench, untouched, untouchable. Yet the truth clung to her like invisible smoke. Beneath the silk and fragrance she ruled a kingdom drowning in its own waste, a realm that smelled of roses only because it reeked of death. And in the years to come, as her body began to fail, that same perfume, the scent that had once shielded her from decay, would become the shroud that concealed it. The Queen of England, perfumed and immaculate, would one day lie in rooms that smelled just as sweet, just as rotten. The scent of empire itself, half glory, half corruption, would linger long after her roses had wilted. By the final decades of her reign, sweetness had become Elizabeth's most dangerous indulgence. Sugar, white, glittering, pure, was the alchemy of empire made edible, a luxury mined from the sweat of distant lands and molded into symbols of divine privilege. It was the taste of victory, of mastery over nature itself, and yet it was killing her. To dine at the Queen's table was to witness excess turned to spectacle. Feasts gleamed with candied fruits, sugar-glazed flowers, and edible sculptures shaped into castles, serpents, and saints. Entire banquets were built not from meat and grain, but from sugar alone. The Queen's cooks, part artisans, part chemists, carved sweetness into power. Every bite was a declaration. England was wealthy enough to turn the rarest of imports into playthings. But beneath the theater of opulence, the Queen's appetite had begun to betray her. Elizabeth adored sweets with an almost childlike passion, the product of a lifetime of scarcity now overturned by empire. In her youth, sugar was a medicine. a spice used sparingly to mask bitterness. By her maturity, it had become abundance itself. Her teeth bore the record of this change, turning from symbols of grace into evidence of decay. Contemporary observers whispered about it with morbid fascination. The Venetian ambassador noted that her smile had grown black and unseemly. A court physician described her breath as most noxious, her speech muffled by the rot within. Yet no one dared to confront her directly. Her teeth had become as untouchable as her crown. To understand why, one must understand the alchemy of perception in the Tudor court. Decay was not interpreted as failure. It was mistaken for fashion. The queen's darkened teeth became so infamous that noblewomen began to imitate them, smudging soot on their smiles to appear as though they too could afford such luxury. Black teeth became the badge of privilege, proof that one could feast on the same delights as Gloriana herself. But for Elizabeth, there was no disguise, only pain. Her gums swelled, her jaw ached, and each meal brought fresh agony. Still, she refused to part with her teeth. Extraction in the 16th century was barbaric. Metal pliers, no anesthesia, and a prayer for mercy. When her counselor, Richard Carey, offered to have one of his own teeth pulled in her presence to prove the safety of the procedure, the gesture was both gallant and grotesque. She watched, silent as he screamed through the act, then turned away. She never followed his example. Instead, she sought comfort in rituals of contradiction. Her personal recipe for toothpaste was a bizarre mixture of crushed eggshells, pumice, and sugar, an attempt to polish the very substance that had ruined her. It was a cruel cycle, a queen fighting fire with fire. The sweet grit that touched her tongue each morning only deepened her suffering, feeding the slow erosion beneath her regal facade. As her teeth failed, so too did her voice. Diplomats remarked that her speech grew increasingly difficult to understand, words swallowed by the collapse of bone and enamel. Yet she continued to speak, to negotiate, to command, through the pain, through the rot, as though silence itself might betray weakness. Every smile became an act of statecraft, every grimace a reminder of mortality denied. Sugar, once a symbol of vitality, had turned parasitic. It marked the shift in Elizabeth's England from necessity to indulgence, from conquest to consumption. The spice routes and trade winds that filled her coffers also filled her veins with ruin. From the Caribbean plantations to the London docks, the empire's sweetest export carried the bitterness of enslavement and decay. Few in her court saw this connection, but the queen's body bore it plainly. The high cost of luxury made flesh, and still she would not abstain. Even in her final years, when her meals dwindled to little more than broth and candied violets, she insisted that sugar be served. Perhaps it reminded her of youth, of the early days of her reign when England's power tasted new and pure. Perhaps it was simply the last pleasure she could command. Whatever the reason, it became her quiet rebellion, to cling to sweetness in defiance of time. Those who attended her near the end spoke of her reluctance to eat in company, to be seen. The once dazzling queen who had ruled through presence alone now turned her face away from courtiers, speaking through the curtain of her hair. Her laughter, once bright, was muffled. Her beauty, preserved for decades through artifice, was collapsing inward. In the candlelit hush of her last winter, Elizabeth's table stood largely untouched. The sugar sculptures remained as decoration, untouched monuments to appetite and ambition. When she finally passed, her body bore the marks of a life lived at the crossroads of empire and illusion. The poisons she wore on her skin and those she consumed had converged at last. As her coffin was carried through the cold streets of London, mourners tossed flowers, lilies, roses, violets, their fragrance mingling with the scent of burning tallow. Sweetness still. Always sweetness. But in the air, beneath the perfume, something darker lingered, a trace of the rot that had defined her reign. The Virgin Queen had outlived her beauty, her rivals, and her age. Yet the empire she built would inherit her appetites. Sugar would go on poisoning the world, silently, seductively, just as it had once devoured its most powerful queen.